My goal today is to talk about a little piece of unlike the previous talks that seemed rather huge in their pretensions, I wanted to look at something really quite narrow today and to think about a kind of change that it seems to me is likely going on at the moment in contemporary neuroscience and to puzzle about that change. Maybe I've just reached the point in my career when things start to look more like Kuhn got it right in some ways. And I'm going to try to bring out some of that today. Yeah.
Or you have to click the mouse in the screen. No,
just click here. There you go, and now it should work like this.
Yeah, great. I want to look at a way that our values and our models and our instruments interact with one another, and suggest that they're in a pretty tight connection, so that sometimes when we ask which is the right method or which is the right concept, we're also asking the question, which are the right values that we're deploying in this science, and how are we going to evaluate one piece of science relative to another piece of science. I'll start with this case of apparent conflict between, in this case, explanation and prediction as values of the way that the science ought to operate. And then I'll say some things, although I was really quite puzzled about this a year ago, I now really come down on one side of this discussion, and I'll try to explain why that's the case, and then point to a few problems going forward about how we're going to understand this age-old concept that I learned as an intro to neuroscience student, the idea of the appropriate stimulus, the stimulus that most drives the neuron, and how we should think about that in the wake of the studies that I'm going to talk about. So part of what I'm suggesting today is that there are times when we have a conflict between, on the one hand, the models that we build, and although this is a conference not about models but about concepts, our models are built out of concepts and the relationships between those concepts. So the models that we bring to the system are often things that inform the methods that we use to study that system. And what we take to be a success in that interaction between models and tasks turns on what we value most. Kuhn, at one point in The Structure of Scientific Revolution, says that when we are at this juncture, we rely only on circular justifications, and there's nothing to be said to break out of it. And there was a moment, as I said earlier, in the beginning of my thinking about this project, that it seemed to me that that's exactly where we were. Here's the kind of conflict that I have in mind, and this was presented to me by a guy named Carlos Ponce, who came to me and he said that he was having trouble getting his work accepted for grants because he kept getting the response that it was not mechanistic enough and that he needed it to be more mechanistic. And since I've done work on mechanistic explanation and the character of mechanistic explanation, he thought that perhaps I could be valuable to him in coaching him through how to respond to these grant projects. But in the process, I got involved in an adversarial conference with him and some people that he was in an argument with, and it opened this area of science up to me that I thought was really quite interesting. On the one hand, in this dispute, there's what I will characterize as the old guard. And the old guard approaches visual psychophysics by using pre-selected stimuli to determine which among them maximizes unit neuronal response. And this goes back classically to Hubel and Wiesel and their fortuitous discovery that in taking slides in and out of the projector during an experiment while doing single unit recording in monkey brains, they started getting responses to moving lines. And then they decided that they could try to continue to build on this, and they tried different ways of moving the lines, different orientations for the lines, different thicknesses of lines, on and off lines, etc., and began to build a picture of how the nervous system works, where it starts at the periphery with very simple things like lines, and then concatenates. You add them up, and the structure of the nervous system makes an awful lot of sense under that kind of picture. The content of the neural firing just represents the perceptual features among the pre-selected stimuli to which it's maximally tuned. And the model that they had in mind, as I was just explaining, involves assembly from basic components of increasing complexity with increasing centrality. And this has worked for many people in incredibly good ways, right? It's been applied to motion directions, binocular disparity, curvature, even complex natural shapes such as hands and faces. And part of the key virtue of this all fits together really very nicely. The methods that you use can be designed in order to trigger what you think is going to happen at the next stage of processing. You drop in some electrodes, you look for the maximal response at that stage of processing. And when I say that one of the key virtues here, this one down here at the bottom is actually not from early visual processing, which is where Hubel and Wiesel spent much of their time, but involves V4, a work in V4 by Ed Connor. One of the key virtues here is that, as Galileo said, we're ultimately going to understand how the brain does what it does in terms that are already intelligible to us in some ways. Galileo said that this is the book of nature is written in the language of geometry. And if you really want to understand the book of nature, then you're going to have to learn some geometry. And so when Ed Connor approached this, he decided that he was going to use sort of variants on the old Hubel and Wiesel structure. In this case, things of different angles that could be concave or convex, depending on how they were shaded. And then you would characterize which of these shapes that were pre-selected would maximize the response of the neuron that you happen to be measuring from at that time. And why is it important to have an intelligible model? Well, it's a basic goal of science to deliver understanding of the natural world. And we might think if we don't have an intelligible model, we don't really get understanding. Intelligible models also guide us for theory revision when we find that there's a problem with our theory. We know what areas of the model we can tweak and what areas of the model we cannot tweak. And intelligible models tell us where to intervene into the system for the purposes of making it work in the way that we want to. And ultimately, I think neuroscience is a medical science. And it will be worth its investment when it tells us how to correct problems that affect the human mind. And until it does that, it's merely a promissory note that will continue to get the funding for it. All right. Not to say anything controversial. The other thing that I think is the other approach that's involved here, and we can call it the New Guard approach, or the data-driven approach, involves letting the brain tell us what it wants to see. And so in this case, the task involves, again, presenting images to a monkey. But in this case, we're going to take the images that we start with, which might be sort of naturalistic images or blobs of some sort, and then we're going to see which of those maximize the response profile. This is from the DiCarlo lab. We've already seen some images from the DiCarlo lab in earlier talks, but it was Carlos who was doing the work at the point when I entered into this picture. So you take the monkey and you present it with these images, and then you take the top response getters out of the set of images that you presented to the monkey, and then you put it into a genetic algorithm, and you vary those images until you get another family of images. Now present those to the monk. Now take the top response getters, run them through a genetic algorithm, generate a whole bunch of them, present them to the monk, then see which ones maximize the response, and do this until you plateau. Right? Do this until you get the maximum amount. And in this case, neural firing represents the stimulus type that drives it most, irrespective of whether that stimulus type is chosen from a pre-selected bit of intelligible ways of organizing things. And you might describe this, although it's not entirely accurate to describe it as model-free. There's some model involved here. There's, in a way, you're, as I said earlier, allowing the brain to tell you which things it wants to see, or these neurons to tell you which things they most want to respond to. And what's really kind of interesting about, and I should point out, and this is key to the way I'm going to end the talk, is that these evolved stimuli, it turns out, drive these neurons way more than the selected stimuli that we start with. So these diagrams, the green in these diagrams, represent the what so-called naturalistic stimuli, maybe lines or cups or bowls or monkeys, faces, tennis rackets, that sort of stuff. And the black things in this histogram represent the responses to the evolved images. So you can see that in the histogram, it shifted all the way to the right for these evolved images. That is, you're able to make these neurons dance like they have never danced before by presenting them with these stimuli. And here again, you've got the synthetic ones versus the reference in this diagram, and you can see that it's just off the charts. These are the early synthetic ones, the ones that you start with. These are what you get after you've evolved the stimulus. And this is the thing that you get to categories of different naturalistic stimuli. All right? And it turns out, as Russ was mentioning earlier, that if you look inside these models and you try to make predictions about the neural responses that you get, you're able to predict. Layers of the image generator can be used to predict neural responses to novel natural stimuli. So they say here, distance from the involved synthetic image in FC6 space predicted responses to novel natural images. So you give it images it's never seen, and you're able to better predict the response profile to those images than if you had started with naturalistic phenomena. Instead, this shows that it's possible to use the neuron's evolved images to predict responses to other images, and importantly, responses to the synthetic images were the highest of all. And in further studies, this one's from mice and not from monkeys, but it appears that you can actually do better predictions of the neural response profiles in this case. And this is just a representation of that fact, that in fact the predictions are much better in this case. All right, so now you've got two different ways of studying how the visual system works. One involves starting with stimuli that we antecedently understand and that we can concatenate into a model of how the brain builds a picture of the external world. Another one that allows the brain to tell us what it wants to see, but it ends up delivering images. Oh, I should have pointed out. Look at, these are some of the images that you get as the evolved images. They don't fit into a neat linear story about how the brain is concatenating things. So you're now working with something that's very unlike an intelligible model. So this is why I say it seems like we've got a choice. Should we begin with these relatively simple stimuli, or should we use these newer techniques to evolve the stimuli and let the brain tell us what it wants to respond to? And this is what I mean when I say there's a kind of interdependence between task and model. That on the one hand, we've got stimulus-committed approaches versus data-driven approaches. And those fit with different kinds of models for how the nervous system is working. On the one hand, there's a kind of compositional hierarchy building up from lines to complex objects. And on the other hand, if there's a theory at all, it's a theory about how DCNNs work. All right? And the difference between these really turns on, and this was why there was an adversarial conference. The old guard kept saying, yeah, you can make good predictions, but your model doesn't tell us anything. I don't understand it. It doesn't make sense. It's not an intelligible model. And so that's not doing science properly. And on the other hand, you've got a group of people that say, yeah, but our model makes all the best predictions, and in science, the best predictions win. And to me, that started to look a lot like the way that Kuhn talked about things, namely that the old guard was just going to have to die out at some point to make way for the young guard that's now making better predictions than the old guard. There are anomalies for the old way of doing things. Those anomalies are resolved by this new technology, and the new guard will ultimately provide data-driven approaches based on convolutional neural networks that outpredict the old guard. And if it's the case, as they say, that she who makes the best predictions wins, then the game over. So they say. And if you emphasize intelligibility, then it appears that the old guard wins because the new models don't seem to be intelligible, at least from the point of view of the old guard. Yeah. So when the old guard complains, so what leans on the side of the old guard? Well, the old guard, says that this isn't mechanistic enough. The stimuli aren't rational. These are the natural images over here, and these are the top 10 evolved images. Natural images again. Top 10 evolved images. And the thought is that the stimuli aren't rationally organized. There's no model of the combinatorics in the visual system. There's no guide for theory development moving forward. There's no guide for intervention. It's as if you went to an oracle and you asked it for the right response profiles, and the oracle said, this is how the neurons will dance. And it turns out that the oracle's right. But when you ask the oracle, why do they dance this way? The oracle is silent, and smoke rises above them, right? So what could the new guard say? Well, I think they have a couple of responses. They could say that maybe intelligibility comes at a cost in this case, or that intelligibility may not be necessary, or that intelligibility may be acquired rather than automatic. The cost. Has intelligibility been purchased at the expense of oversimplification? So there's this classic paper now in which they ask, well, this works really well for 15% of the neurons in those early visual areas, but what happens to the other 85% of V1? And perhaps, the studies that we've done have all been biased by this choice of stimuli that we've been using, by the theories that we've got. Maybe our theory, this simple concatenation model, is driving us to only test stimuli that fit with the concatenation model. Maybe we need something better than that. And I could go on a bit about that. I think a second thing that they could say, and would be right, is that intelligibility is hard for the human brain. We have little tiny brains. And wrapping our head around difficult things, especially things that involve lots of moving parts, is very difficult. Mary Hagerty, who's a psychologist at the University of California, Santa Barbara, did studies on whether people can understand how these machines will turn when you crank the one end in a particular direction. And it turns out that we're all very good at solving this one down here in the bottom left. But when we get to the ones over on the right, suddenly it's very hard for us to even understand how these simple mechanical devices will operate. And sometimes in science, we have to learn that things that are very unintelligible to us are in fact the way the world operates. And that the fact that our brain can't wrap itself around these things doesn't mean that they're false. It means that we have to learn new ways to think. And that's not a novel idea. Galileo had to teach people that two things of different weights do not fall at different speeds. And he's got a hilarious passage in the dialogues in which he asks the person to imagine a set of butterflies and a fishbowl sitting inside a boat that is then set in motion. And he asks the reader, would the fish have to swim faster to keep up with the moving boat? Would the butterflies have to furiously flap their wings and find themselves pinned against the back of the cage? And he says, well, of course not, but we've got to learn to think about inertial motion in the right way. Magnets are still totally baffling to me in many ways. And so maybe what we have to do is figure out some new ways to understand how things operate. And maybe intelligibility is often borrowed from our fanciest technology. Here, this enchanted loom between my ears, right? This set of telegraph wires in virtue of which I do the things that I do. This computer, perhaps this DCNN, is the tool with which we need to learn to understand the new things that we're learning about how the brain operates. So here's this paper by Driscoll and Shenoy and Ciccio that introduces a whole set of tools for making intelligibility out of complex things like DCNNs. And similarly, I think we're beginning, as Russ mentioned earlier, to build models of the nervous system that look exactly like the kind of thing that we're talking about in this case. So on behalf of the new guard, I'd have to say maybe we can have prediction and explanation at the same time, but we have to give ourselves some time to wrap our heads around this new technology, this new way of rendering things intelligible. And first we have to internalize the workings of these DCNNs. The explanatory principles might be different, and they take time for us to learn, but today's unintelligible predictor might be tomorrow's intelligible explanation. But now, just to bring this to a close, I really wanted to keep it at 20 minutes if it was at all possible. The question that I have is, what happens to this age-old concept of the preferred stimulus, which was the thing that most drives the neurons? Does the fact that we can make the neurons dance with these evolved images indicate that that's what the neurons are actually there to detect? Or is it like giving somebody an opioid, like fentanyl, and watching the opioid receptor response, which was not at all part of the evolved history of this thing? Are we overdriving the system in some ways? And that question becomes really quite potent in this case, because we don't know how to answer it. Like, at what point in presenting these stimuli are we hyperdriving the system, and at what point are we hitting that sweet spot? So is the rule maximize neural responses? Is that sufficient for determining the content of a neural representation? I think now that question is thrown into doubt. That way of operating seems, at least to me, to be questionable at this point. And if not, how do we restrict the preferred stimulus to a submaximal region of the neural response? And then furthermore, I guess I would ask, what is it that we're trying to predict? And maybe this is part of the solution that we've got. Are we trying to predict neural responses? Or are we trying to understand behavior, and so to predict behavior? And at this point, what we get is from stimulus to neural response. But we really need to get from that neural response to some kind of behavior to tell what it is in between that's really making a difference. So recent advances in the methodology of visual physiology appear to pit intelligibility and prediction against one another. But that apparent conflict might be fleeting and might be surmountable. Intelligibility is overrated, in my view, and it's defeasible. Intelligibility is also a learned skill and the kind of thing that we can acquire if we put our heads to it. Yet the new tools raise a problem for assigning content to the activities of neurons that, at least at the moment, it's not clear how to solve. And they have explanatory limits to overcome in making sense of behavior versus neural responses. But either way, we're rethinking the function of cortical responses to visual stimuli, and in the same way, we're seeing how advances in models and techniques can have an influence on the kind of concepts that we deploy and the kind of concepts that seem natural to us. Thank you.
All right, time for questions.